C.S. Lewis and the Church of Rome, A Study in Proto-Ecumenism by Christopher Derrick. Introduction. As a pupil and long-term friend of C.S. Lewis and a student of his work, I have often been asked why he never became a Roman Catholic. This book is primarily an attempt to analyze the relevant aspects of his thought and so cast some light upon that question. Thence, and in a secondary way, it draws what I take to be a highly pertinent moral for all those who now concern themselves with the related but distinct causes of ecumenism and of Christian unity. At the outset, I should make it clear that I approach my subject from a Roman Catholic standpoint, and am therefore somewhat critical of certain aspects of Lewis's religious thought. I am extremely anxious, however, not to give any generally negative impression, as though Lewis were, in my opinion, an overrated writer who needed to be cut down to size. Let me therefore say that I regard him not only as a superlative tutor and a friend beyond compare, but also as a religious thinker and writer of the first order, from whom any possible reader, Catholic or Protestant or whatever, can learn, and, a rare thing this, learn enjoyably. Within the English-speaking world and elsewhere too, 20th century Christianity owes him an immeasurable debt, only comparable to the debt which it owed some 50 years ago to Chesterton. He was a very great man, and can afford to concede points. If I now make certain points against him for the narrowly defined purposes of this book, I do so marginally, as it were, and in full recognition of his greatness. As I have said, I write from a Roman Catholic standpoint. Some may object, however, that I understand that standpoint and faith in absurdly dated terms which could be taken for granted when the most active Roman Catholic apologists were men like Arnold Lunn and Ronald Knox, but which are of little or no relevance to the post-conciliar church of today. An immense turbulence of change and questioning and renewal has come upon the Roman Catholic Church, once so very stable and assured and rock-like since the Second Vatican Council. Its old certainties have been cast in doubt, its old absolutes have proved relative and highly questionable, and, in particular, its old claim to be the Church, as against the sects, has been tacitly but clearly abandoned. Am I perhaps guilty of writing as though all this had simply not happened at all? It would be my first and provocative instinct to reply that it mostly didn't happen at all, that a very large proportion of what gets so described is a kind of myth, generated by the media, always avid for change and contention, and by certain restless theologians. The phenomenon in question certainly exists, but it does not quite have that romantic and revolutionary character. The real picture is more prosaic and sad. There has been a widespread loss of faith among the Catholic intelligentsia. Many of those concerned are unwilling to face the fact of their loss, and therefore desire most urgently, and at any cost in intellectual absurdity, that Roman Catholicism should somehow transmogrify itself into something in which they still do believe, into a vague pan-Anglican Christianity, perhaps, or some kind of social welfare secular humanism, garnished with a top-dressing of Catholic terminology. But any such reply, if developed further, would sidetrack me into the writing of another and very different book. So I must control myself and point out that since Lewis died at the very beginning of the Second Vatican Council, he can have had no active relationship with anything which the Roman Catholic Church has become since that council, and even, though a big question arises here, because of that council and by its authority. My subject is his relationship with the Roman Catholic Church as it existed and was understood in his own lifetime. With the question of how radically it has changed since then, and of how radically it is capable of changing, this book is not concerned. Why didn't Lewis become a Roman Catholic? Such a question might be considered divisive, arbitrary, and in any case unanswerable. Ought it to be raised at all? In any strict sense, it is of course an unanswerable question. A Catholic will say that the operations of divine grace in its relationship to human free will must always be mysterious. An agnostic will say something rather similar about the psychology of religious belief and of any possible change in religious alliance. Nonetheless, a man who writes as extensively as Lewis did, and about religious matters which necessarily stand in some kind of relationship to Roman Catholic belief, is likely to drop certain hints at least, such as will make the question less than totally unanswerable. I believe that Lewis did a great deal more than any mere dropping of hints, and while much has been written about him and his work, this particular aspect of his thought has not yet, as far as I know, received any systematic and critical treatment. Nor is the question an arbitrary one. This is not like asking why Winston Churchill never became a Mormon, or why Picasso dissented from the views of the Plymouth Brethren. A Roman Catholic would probably give offense if he suggested that the manifest rightness of his own faith ought to have been detected and embraced by a man of Lewis's percipience, so that an intriguing riddle is posed by the fact that it wasn't. But the matter can be seen in less loaded and triumphal terms. It is a fact of record that some people do become Roman Catholics, rightly or wrongly, and that their tendency in that direction is often noticed, well before the event, and with delight or alarm as the case may be, by those who know them or their writings. Chesterton is a case in point. Countless people wondered why it took him such a long time to find the true faith, if you like to put it that way, or to follow the superstitious bent of his mind to its ultimate absurdity, if you like to put it that way. There were similarly varied wonderings about Lewis. Some Roman Catholics were, to speak cynically, eager and impatient to see their church catching such a very big fish. Some Anglicans, and Protestants in general, were anxious and apprehensive in the contrary sense. Then there were the atheists and materialists. Their question was, having sunk so far already into superstition and fanaticism, why doesn't Lewis go the whole hog and hand his soul over to the Pope? Rumors that he had in fact done so used to circulate repeatedly in post-war Oxford, as I remember well. I even heard it suggested on one occasion that Lewis was a Roman Catholic and always had been, and was indeed a Jesuit operating behind a front or cover of Anglicanism for tactical reasons. If he protested loudly that he was nothing of the kind, this would of course be typical Jesuitry. Comparable ideas are still encountered. I have met some Catholics, chiefly in the United States, who took it for granted that a writer whom they valued so highly must have been fully of their faith and church, and were astonished to learn that he was not. That particular mistake was perhaps not made very widely in Lewis's own country, but to many people of widely differing beliefs, it seemed obvious that he was proceeding at his own pace along the well-charted and much-traveled path to Rome. The question of why he never got there is a real one, asked by many, and there is nothing arbitrary about even a limited attempt to answer it. Even so, some will regard this as precisely the kind of divisive question which, in these ecumenical days, one should not raise, especially if one claims to hold Lewis and his work in high regard. It is of course a question of the denominational kind. To raise it is to focus attention upon certain barriers which have divided Christians in the past and still continue to divide them, and in particular upon the old and blood-stained brick wall which separates Canterbury from Rome. But it is widely believed that in our time, these denominational barriers are ceasing to be important, or even interesting, and need most urgently to be transcended or simply ignored. Close attention to them can only divide those who ought to be united in Christ, and the present state of affairs in Lewis's own home city of Belfast shows what bitter consequences can follow, even nowadays. On the ecumenical principles which exercise such influence over present-day Christian thinking, it might therefore be argued that this book should never have been written at all. Its central question should simply not be asked, unless we favor divisiveness and bad blood. Such arguments need to be taken seriously. In reply, one might quote New Testament evidence to show that while the Christian gospel was always, in one sense, a unifying thing, it was also, in another sense, and from the start, a dividing thing, setting one man against another, and even breaking up families. In Patria, Christians hope to find total unity in Christ, but here in Via, they must not treat simple unity as an unqualified absolute. One might also question the intellectual propriety of looking with disapproval upon some inquiry because of the consequences that may follow from it. Isn't this what they call obscurantism? And then there is a good deal to be said for Lewis's own habit of critical detachment from the dominant fads and fashions of one's own day. It would be absurd and offensive to suggest that the ecumenism of today is simply a fad and fashion. But it would be unrealistic to deny that in some versions, and is cherished by some people, it has that kind of character to some degree, and will then provide no sound basis for criticizing my present project or any other. But no such excuses will suffice if we are to take Lewis seriously. He would have granted their limited validity, and that last point in particular. But the whole thrust of his thought was in the opposite direction. If we took the lowest possible view and described ecumenism as a fad and fashion and nothing more, it would still be a fad and fashion that was very largely pioneered in the English-speaking world by Lewis himself. He was an ecumenist, in effect, long before the word, or even the idea, became fashionable. His works are numerous, his achievement is complex, but if one were asked to draw out and define whatever element in his thought was the most characteristic and has subsequently been the most influential, one would probably do best to choose the concept of mere Christianity, the idea that when talking about the faith and following of Jesus, one can and indeed should prescind altogether from denominational differences. This was Lewis's often repeated precept and his practice as well, and, as I have already observed, it made him into that rare and most useful thing, a Christian writer who can be read with equal profit and delight by an evangelical Protestant, an Anglican of whatever churchmanship, and a most sternly traditional Roman Catholic, not to mention the atheist who is just beginning to doubt. His proto-ecumenism made him into a man for all readers. Why didn't he become a Roman Catholic? Lewis intensely disliked any raising of that question, or of any similarly denominational question, and having known him well, I have no doubt at all that during his lifetime he would have disapproved most strongly of this present book. A question therefore arises as to the propriety of my writing it, 16 years after his death and, as it were, behind his back, when he can no longer reply, not in print, nor yet in that thunderous voice of annihilating irony which all his pupils remember. Am I perhaps betraying a friendship? I think I can claim, rather, to be fulfilling one. Lewis was always, quote, hungry for rational opposition. But while he still carried certain burdens of his earthly inheritance, he had a marked tendency to lose this appetite for rational opposition as soon as one particular item appeared on the menu, namely, the subject of this book. And so, like a fatty child, he lost the nourishment and pleasure of certain good dishes. But now he has shed those burdens, and with them that fattiness. I may not be the best of cooks, but I can claim to be offering him a further supply of what he always liked, in a version which he will not now find unpalatable. Any further development of this self-justification would be intolerably whimsical and theologically dangerous too. Whatever the depth of his present penetration into deep heaven, Lewis certainly has better things to think about now than religious controversy. He once told me, in the spirit of the Great Divorce, that my own addiction to that drug would make me feel far more at home in hell than in heaven. But I do wish to make it clear that I intend this book as a development of my friendship with Lewis and my regard for him, not as anything more negative or hostile. It may still be seen, however, as a sin against the spirit of ecumenism. If any reader does see it like that, let me refer him to Chapter 5 of this book, while assuring him that I entirely and passionately share Lewis's detestation of the denominational differences that now weaken Christendom so shamefully, and in particular that brick wall between Rome and Canterbury. But I do have a suspicion that where some undesirable brick wall exists, you cannot get rid of it by ignoring it. The thing to do is to study it, and work out how it was built, and why, and locate its strengths and weaknesses. Then, when you fully understand its structure, you can attempt the task of demolition with suitable implements, and people on both sides of it will be able to help you, so long as they have learned the same lessons and faced the facts about what kind of wall it is. The task of getting it down may be more painful for the people on the one side of the wall, or perhaps for the people on the other side of it. That depends upon the structural realities of the situation and has nothing to do with the personal merits of either party. You may get hurt. You may have to suffer the possibly greater pain of seeing other people hurt while you remain comfortable. Both risks are involved in the task and have to be accepted all around. The main thing is to get the wall down. It therefore needs attention. No good at all is done by those who hate brick walls so much that they cannot bear to think or talk about them or their nature or structure, and who therefore pretend that this particular wall isn't really there, or isn't really made of brick. Real questions don't disappear or resolve themselves by magic when it ceases to be fashionable to talk about them. Any discussion of this wall creates a problem of terminology, as Lewis found. Later on, I shall have something to say about his answer to this problem. In the meantime, I had better explain my own practical working answer to it, which is intended to be purely functional, a matter of descriptive rather than of prescriptive linguistics, and not to beg any question or give offense in any quarter. In the chapters that follow, I mostly use the word Catholic in the sense which it most commonly bears in present-day English usage, to mean Roman Catholic, or as Lewis liked to say, Papist. From time to time I also use the word Protestant in a sense which includes the Church of England and the wider Anglican Communion, as sharing historically in the Reformation inheritance. In doing so, I am following Lewis and claiming the freedom of my ain vulgaire. the language I learned as a child. This has at least the merit of corresponding closely with dominant usage and therefore of easing communication. And if by using it I sometimes appear to be making some sly point, this is a point which I proclaim more frankly elsewhere and am prepared to defend. No semantic smuggling is intended. There is perhaps no totally satisfactory answer to this problem of terminology. My own working answer to it is what seems to me the most useful for the purposes of this book, and I apologize for any offense which it may possibly give per accidens.